The Bennett family car wound its way down the narrow, tree-lined road, the dense canopy above casting dappled shadows on the cracked asphalt. Towering oaks, draped in Spanish moss, stood like silent sentinels, watching over the path that led to their new home. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant, faint aroma of the bayou. Martha Bennett glanced back at her children, Emily and Michael, who were wide-eyed with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Emily, the youngest at 8 years old, clutched her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hops, tightly to her chest, while 12-year-old Michael had his nose buried in a book about local history. Beside her, Tom Bennett drove with a look of determined optimism, his grip on the steering wheel tightening as they approached the turn for Willowshade Plantation. "There it is," Tom announced, pointing ahead. As they rounded the final bend, the grand house came into view. Willowshade Plantation stood tall and imposing, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun. The house was a perfect example of antebellum architecture, meticulously restored to its former glory. Despite its beauty, there was an undeniable aura of melancholy that seemed to cling to it like a shroud. "Wow," Michael breathed, lowering his book to get a better look. "It's huge!" Martha forced a smile, hoping to mask her own unease. "Yes, it is. It's going to be a wonderful home for us." Emily, however, seemed less convinced. She stared at the house with a furrowed brow, her small fingers tightening around Mr. Hops. "It looks sad," she said quietly. Tom chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, it's just been waiting for a family to bring some life back into it. That's our job now." They pulled up to the front of the house, the car tires crunching on the gravel driveway. As they stepped out, the silence of the surrounding land enveloped them. The only sounds were the distant chirping of birds and the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Martha shivered despite the warmth of the day. "Let's go inside and take a look around," she suggested, leading the way up the stone steps to the front door. The old key turned easily in the lock, and the door creaked open, revealing a spacious foyer with high ceilings and polished wooden floors. The house was furnished with period pieces, each room a testament to the plantation's storied past. Tom and Martha wandered through the grand rooms, admiring the antique furniture and intricate woodwork, while the children explored on their own. Michael was drawn to the library, where he immediately began scanning the shelves filled with dusty, leather-bound books. Emily, on the other hand, wandered through the hallways, her footsteps echoing softly against the walls. She paused in front of a large portrait of a stern-looking man in a dark suit, his eyes seeming to follow her as she moved. "Who's that?" she asked as her parents joined her in the hallway. Tom glanced at the plaque beneath the portrait. "That's Jonathan Willowshade, the original owner of the plantation. He built this house in the early 1800s. Emily nodded slowly, but her eyes lingered on the painting, a flicker of unease passing over her face. "I don't like him," she whispered to Mr. Hops. As the afternoon turned to evening, the Bennetts settled into their new home. They gathered around the large dining table for their first meal, the warm glow of the chandelier casting a comforting light. Tom raised his glass in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said with a smile. "To new beginnings," they echoed, clinking their glasses together. But as they ate, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that unseen eyes were watching them from the shadows. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Emily stood at her bedroom window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. The trees cast long, eerie shadows across the lawn, and the old slave quarters at the edge of the property seemed to loom ominously in the darkness. She turned to climb into bed, but stopped when she heard a faint whispering. "Emily." Her heart pounded as she glanced around the room. "Michael, is that you?" But there was no answer. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Emily, help us." Terrified, Emily ran to her parents' room, her eyes wide with fear. "Mommy, Daddy, there's someone in my room!" Martha pulled her close, soothing her with gentle words. "It's just your imagination, sweetheart. This house is old, and old houses make strange noises. There's nothing to be afraid of." But as Emily lay in bed that night, clutching Mr. Hops tightly, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The whispers continued, echoing in her mind until she finally fell into a restless sleep. Down the hall, Martha lay awake, her husband's steady breathing beside her. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house. She wanted to believe it was just the sounds of settling wood and the whisper of the wind. But deep down, she felt a cold knot of dread. Willowshade Plantation was beautiful, yes, but it was also steeped in history, a history that refused to be forgotten. The next morning dawned bright and clear, with golden sunlight streaming through the plantation's tall windows. The Bennetts gathered in the kitchen for breakfast, the events of the previous night seemingly behind them. Emily, however, was unusually quiet, pushing her cereal around in her bowl. "Everything okay, sweetie?" Martha asked, trying to catch her daughter's eye. Emily nodded, but the dark circles under her eyes betrayed her restless sleep. "Just tired," she mumbled. "Well, once we get everything unpacked, it'll start to feel more like home," Tom said, ruffling Emily's hair. "How about a tour of the grounds after breakfast?" The family agreed, and soon they were exploring the sprawling estate. The plantation's grounds were vast and overgrown, with wildflowers blooming in untended gardens and ancient trees casting long shadows. They strolled past the old slave quarters, now empty and decrepit, their silent presence a stark reminder of the land's dark past. As they walked, Emily lagged behind, drawn towards a dilapidated shed partially hidden by vines. She hesitated at the doorway, a chill running down her spine as she peered inside. The interior was dark, filled with cobwebs and the faint smell of decay. "Emily, come on!" Michael called, noticing his sister's absence. Reluctantly, she turned away from the shed, but not before she heard it again. A faint, sorrowful whisper. "Emily, find us." Her heart raced as she caught up with her family, but she said nothing about the voice. Instead, she tried to focus on the beauty of the plantation, hoping the whispers were just a figment of her imagination. Over the next few days, the family settled into a routine. Tom worked on the house, fixing up old rooms and repairing the roof, while Martha unpacked boxes and arranged the furniture. Michael busied himself with exploring the nearby woods and cataloging the different birds he saw, his notebook quickly filling with sketches and observations. Emily, however, remained uneasy. The whispers followed her everywhere, growing more persistent and desperate. She would hear them in the quiet moments when the house was still, and the only sound was the creaking of old wood. They seemed to seep from the walls, curling around her like a cold mist. One afternoon, as Martha was organizing the kitchen, she heard Emily talking in the hallway. She peeked out to see her daughter standing by the wall, her face pale and eyes wide. "Emily, who are you talking to?" Martha asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and concern. Emily turned, her expression confused. "The people in the walls," she said simply. Martha felt a chill. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "They're sad," Emily whispered. "They want help. They say they can't leave." Martha knelt down and pulled Emily into a hug. "It's just the house settling, making strange noises. There's nothing to worry about." Emily nodded, but Martha could tell she wasn't convinced. As the days passed, the whispers grew louder, and Emily became more withdrawn. The once lively and curious child now seemed haunted, her laughter replaced by uneasy silence. One evening, as Tom and Martha sat in the living room, discussing the renovations, they heard a loud crash from Emily's room. They rushed upstairs to find her standing in the middle of the room, her eyes wide with fear, surrounded by broken glass from a fallen picture frame. "Emily, what happened?" Tom asked, scooping her up into his arms. "They're angry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They don't want us here." Martha exchanged a worried glance with Tom. "Maybe we should call someone, an expert on these kinds of things," she suggested, "just to make sure there's nothing unusual happening." Tom nodded reluctantly. "If it'll put our minds at ease, it's worth a shot." The next day, they contacted a local historian, Dr. Samuel Prescott, who had written extensively about the plantation's history. When he arrived, he was a tall, thin man with a serious demeanor, his eyes sharp and inquisitive behind wire-rimmed glasses. "The history of Willowshade is indeed a tragic one," he said as they sat in the parlor sipping tea. "Jonathan Willowshade was known for his cruelty. Many enslaved people suffered and died here. It's not uncommon for places with such dark pasts to have lingering spirits." "Do you think that's what's happening here?" Tom asked, his skepticism evident. Dr. Prescott nodded slowly. "It's possible. The spirits of those who suffered might be trying to communicate. They could be trapped, unable to move on because of the atrocities they endured." Martha shivered. "Is there anything we can do to help them?" "There are rituals, ways to cleanse the house and offer peace to the restless souls," Dr. Prescott said. "But it's not without risk. Sometimes the spirits don't want to leave. They want justice." As night fell, the Bennetts tried to go about their evening as usual, but the atmosphere was heavy with unease. Emily clung to her mother, her eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. And then, as the clock struck midnight, the whispers began anew. This time, they were louder, more insistent, filling the house with a chorus of sorrow and rage. "Emily, help us. Free us." The family huddled together in the living room, their fear palpable. They realized that the whispers were not just sounds, but voices of the past, seeking retribution and release. Willowshade Plantation was not just a house. It was a living, breathing entity, haunted by the spirits of those who had suffered and died within its walls. The Bennetts were no longer just inhabitants. They were part of the plantation's tragic legacy, drawn into a struggle between the living and the dead. The following day, determined to get to the bottom of the strange occurrences, Tom and Martha decided to investigate the plantation's history further. They hoped that by understanding the past, they could find a way to put the restless spirits to peace. Tom headed out to the barn to continue his work on the renovations, while Martha stayed inside with Emily and Michael. The old barn was a massive structure, filled with decaying hay and the remnants of farming tools from another era. As Tom moved a pile of rotting wood, he noticed something odd protruding from the dirt floor. Curious, he knelt down and began to dig. It wasn't long before he unearthed a set of rusted shackles, their iron links worn but unmistakable. His heart pounded as he realized the grim significance of his discovery. He dug deeper, finding more relics, broken pottery, tattered scraps of clothing, and a small leather-bound diary. Tom carefully opened the diary, the pages brittle with age. The handwriting was difficult to read, but the anguish in the words was clear. It was the journal of an enslaved woman named Sarah, who had lived and suffered on the plantation. Her entries detailed the brutal treatment she and others had endured, their lives filled with hardship and sorrow. Back inside the house, Martha was organizing the attic when she stumbled upon an old trunk. Inside, she found faded photographs, yellowed letters, and other personal belongings from the plantation's past residents. Among the items was a silver locket, engraved with the initials S.W. Sarah Willowshade, the name matching the journal Tom had found. Martha felt a shiver run down her spine as she realized the locket might have belonged to the woman who wrote the diary. She carefully placed the items back in the trunk and headed downstairs to find Tom. When she reached the barn, Tom was still poring over the diary. "Look at this," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "This diary belonged to one of the enslaved women here. Her name was Sarah. She describes the horrors she endured, and it sounds like she died under terrible circumstances." Martha showed him the locket and other items she had found. "These must have belonged to her, too. What do you think it means?" Tom shook his head, a deep frown creasing his brow. "I'm not sure, but I think we need to show these to Dr. Prescott. Maybe he can help us make sense of it all." That evening, Dr. Prescott arrived, his face grave as he examined the items they had found. "These artifacts are powerful," he said. "They hold the energy of their former owners, and that energy can be a conduit for the spirits. Sarah's spirit is likely one of those trapped here, seeking justice for what happened to her." Emily, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "I hear her, you know. She talks to me. She wants us to help her." Dr. Prescott nodded. "Children are often more sensitive to the spirit world. If Sarah is reaching out to you, Emily, it's because she believes you can help her find peace." The family huddled closer together, the weight of their discovery sinking in. They realized that the plantation's history was not just a series of distant events, but a living, breathing presence that had seeped into every corner of their new home. Determined to learn more, Tom and Martha decided to delve deeper into the plantation's records. They visited the local library, sifting through old documents and newspaper clippings. The more they read, the more they uncovered about the horrors that had transpired at Willowshade. Jonathan Willowshade had been a ruthless man, known for his cruelty. The plantation had been a place of suffering and death, with countless enslaved people subjected to unimaginable torment. There were stories of brutal punishments, families torn apart, and lives cut tragically short. One story in particular stood out to them. It was about a young woman named Sarah who had led a failed escape attempt. She had been captured, beaten, and left to die as a warning to others. Her death had been particularly brutal, and her spirit was said to haunt the plantation, seeking vengeance for her untimely demise. Armed with this knowledge, the Bennetts felt a renewed sense of purpose. They knew they had to find a way to help Sarah and the other spirits trapped within Willowshade. It was the only way to bring peace to their home and end the haunting that had begun to consume their lives. That night, As they gathered around the fireplace, the air was heavy with anticipation. Emily sat close to her mother, clutching Meister Hops tightly. Michael stared into the flames, his usually curious eyes now filled with determination. Tom cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We need to do something. We can't just let these spirits suffer. Dr. Prescott, what do you suggest we do next?" Dr. Prescott leaned forward, his expression serious. "We need to perform a ritual of release. It will involve gathering at the site where Sarah and the others suffered most. We must offer them an apology, acknowledge their pain, and ask for their forgiveness. It's a dangerous process, but it's the only way to set them free." Martha nodded, her resolve hardening. "We'll do whatever it takes. We can't let this continue." As they prepared for the ritual, the whispers in the walls grew louder, more insistent. The spirits knew that their time was near, and their desperation was palpable. The Bennetts could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on them, urging them forward. The night of the ritual arrived, and the family gathered in the old graveyard at the edge of the plantation. The moon was full, casting an eerie light over the weathered tombstones. Dr. Prescott began to chant, his voice low and steady, as he guided them through the ritual. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, and the whispers swelled into a cacophony of sorrow and rage. Emily clung to her mother, her eyes wide with fear, but she did not waver. As the ritual reached its climax, a piercing wail echoed through the night, and the spirits of Willowshade Plantation appeared before them. They were spectral figures, their faces twisted in anguish, their eyes filled with a desperate yearning for justice. Tom stepped forward, his voice shaking but resolute. "We are sorry for the suffering you endured. We acknowledge your pain and ask for your forgiveness. We want to help you find peace." For a moment, the spirits seemed to waver, their forms flickering in the moonlight. Then slowly they began to fade, their anguished cries softening into a whisper. As the last of the spirits disappeared, a profound silence settled over the graveyard. The ritual was complete. The spirits of Willowshade Plantation had been released, their torment finally at an end. The Bennetts stood together, exhausted but relieved, knowing they had done the right thing. As they made their way back to the house, Emily glanced over her shoulder one last time. She thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the graveyard, watching them. It was Sarah, her face peaceful at last, her spirit free. The Bennetts knew that their lives would never be the same, but they had found a sense of closure. They had confronted the darkness of the past and brought light to a place shrouded in shadows. Willowshade Plantation was still haunted, but now it was a place of remembrance and reconciliation, a testament to the enduring power of justice and forgiveness. The nights that followed the ritual were eerily quiet. The oppressive atmosphere that had once hung over Willowshade Plantation seemed to have lifted. Yet despite the apparent calm, the Bennetts could not shake the feeling that something lingered. Their sleep, once restless with the whispers of the past, was now invaded by vivid nightmares. Martha awoke one night in a cold sweat, her heart racing. She had dreamt of Sarah, but this time the vision was more intense, more real. Sarah had been calling out to her, begging for help, her face twisted in agony. Martha looked over at Tom, who was also wide awake, his face pale. "Did you have the dream too?" she whispered. He nodded, wiping his forehead. "Yes. It was like she was here with us. The next morning, over breakfast, they discovered that Emily and Michael had experienced the same haunting visions. Emily's eyes were red from crying, and Michael's usual confidence had been replaced by a haunted look. "We were in the fields," Michael said quietly, pushing his food around his plate. "There were so many people all crying out for help. And then there was Sarah. She was trying to reach us, but she kept fading away." Emily nodded, clutching Mr. Hops tightly. "They're still here, Mommy. They're not gone." Martha exchanged a worried glance with Tom. "We need to do something," she said. "We can't go on like this." Dr. Prescott returned to the plantation later that day. His face grew grave as he listened to their accounts. "It seems the ritual was only partially successful. The spirits may have been acknowledged, but their suffering runs deep. They're still trying to communicate with you." "What can we do?" Tom asked. "How do we help them move on completely?" Dr. Prescott thought for a moment. "We need to understand more about their individual stories. The items you found, Sarah's diary, the locket, are keys to their past. We need to find more of these connections, to piece together their stories and give them the recognition they deserve." Determined to uncover more, the Bennetts delved deeper into the plantation's grounds. They began their search in the cellar, a dark and musty space that seemed untouched by time. As they combed through the clutter, they found more remnants of the past. Old tools, broken pottery, and a collection of letters bound together with twine. The letters were written by various enslaved people, each detailing their daily lives, their hopes, and their despair. One letter, written by a man named Joshua, spoke of his longing for freedom and his plans to escape with his family. Another, by a woman named Mary, described the loss of her children and her grief. The more they read, the more the Bennetts felt the weight of the plantation's history pressing down on them. These were not just stories. They were cries for justice, for acknowledgement, for peace. As they worked, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the temperature would drop suddenly, sending chills down their spines. Emily was the most affected, her sensitivity to the spirits growing stronger each day. She would often stand still, listening to voices only she could hear. One afternoon, as they gathered in the living room to review their findings, Emily spoke up. "They want us to see something," she said, her voice distant. "There's a place we haven't found yet. It's important." Tom looked at Dr. Prescott, who nodded. "Sometimes spirits are tied to specific locations. There may be a hidden part of the plantation that holds the key to releasing them." Following Emily's instincts, they ventured out to the far end of the property, to a place overgrown with weeds and tangled vines. Emily led them to a spot near the edge of the woods, where the ground seemed disturbed. They began to dig, the soil giving way easily as if it had been waiting for them. Soon they uncovered a hidden cellar, its entrance sealed with heavy stones. With some effort, they pried the stones away and descended into the darkness below. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and their flashlights revealed a room filled with makeshift beds and tattered blankets. "This must have been a hiding place," Dr. Prescott said, his voice echoing in the confined space. "A refuge for those trying to escape." As they explored the cellar, they found more personal items. A child's toy, a woman's comb, a man's shoe. Each item told a story of desperation and hope, of lives lived in the shadows, always on the brink of discovery. Emily paused by one of the beds, her hand resting on a small, worn Bible. "They prayed here," she said softly. "They asked for help, but it never came." Martha felt a surge of emotion. "We need to bring these items back to the house, to create a memorial for them. They need to be remembered, not just as victims, but as people with hopes and dreams." That night, they set up a small altar in the living room, placing the items they had found on it. They lit candles and said prayers, asking for forgiveness and peace for the souls that had suffered. As the candles burned, the atmosphere in the house began to change. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, and the shadows seemed less menacing. The nightmares, however, did not cease. They were now more focused, more intense, as if the spirits were trying to convey something specific. Emily woke up screaming one night, her eyes wide with terror. "There's a place we haven't seen yet," she cried. "It's where they died. We have to find it." Tom and Martha comforted her, their own fear mounting. They knew that the spirits would not rest until they had uncovered every dark corner of Willowshade Plantation. The echoes of agony would continue to haunt them, driving them to uncover the final secrets buried within the walls of their home. As dawn approached, they steeled themselves for the next phase of their journey. They would not rest until the spirits of Willowshade were at peace and their own family freed from the grip of the past. The plantation, with all its dark history, would finally be a place of remembrance and healing, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The next morning, the family gathered around the breakfast table, the weight of the previous night's revelations hanging heavily over them. Emily seemed particularly troubled, her eyes dark with sleeplessness. Tom and Martha exchanged worried glances, knowing that they had to continue their search for the truth behind the haunting. "Emily," Martha began gently, "you mentioned something about a place we haven't seen yet. Can you tell us more about it?" Emily nodded slowly. "It's a small room, hidden somewhere in the house. I can hear the cries of children when I'm near it. They're so sad and scared." Michael, ever the skeptic, frowned. "A hidden room? Are you sure it's not just another dream, Em?" But Emily shook her head firmly. "No, it's real. I feel it. We have to find it." Tom, his resolve hardening, stood up. "Then we'll search every inch of this house until we find it. Let's start with the upstairs. We haven't explored all the rooms up there yet." They began their search methodically, room by room, tapping on walls and floors for any signs of hidden spaces. Hours passed with no success, but Emily's insistence kept them going. Finally, as they were about to call it a day, Emily stopped in front of a seemingly ordinary wall at the end of the upstairs hallway. "It's here," she whispered, placing her hand against the wall. "I can hear them." Tom and Michael exchanged doubtful glances, but Tom began to tap on the wall. To their surprise, the sound was hollow. With renewed determination, they pried off the wooden paneling, revealing a narrow door behind it. The door was old and weathered, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. Martha's heart raced as Tom slowly turned the rusted knob. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room. The air inside was thick and musty, carrying a faint metallic scent. As they stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop, and an overwhelming sense of sorrow washed over them. The room was sparsely furnished, with only a few small beds and a wooden chest in the corner. Toys lay scattered on the floor, their once bright colors faded with age. The walls bore faint marks, as if small hands had scratched at them in desperation. Martha's eyes filled with tears. "This must have been where they kept the children," she said softly. "Separated from their families, all alone and scared." Emily walked over to the wooden chest and carefully opened it. Inside, she found more relics: tiny shoes, a threadbare blanket, and a doll missing an eye. As she touched the items, the room seemed to come alive with the sounds of distant cries and whispers. "They're telling us their stories," Emily said, her voice trembling. "They want us to know what happened to them." Dr. Prescott, who had joined them for the search, stepped forward. "This room is a powerful place, a focal point of the suffering that occurred here. The spirits of these children are still trapped, their anguish echoing through time." Tom knelt down beside Emily, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "What can we do to help them, Doctor?" "We need to honor their memories," Dr. Prescott replied. "We should create a memorial for them, just like we did with the other items. And we need to conduct another ritual, this time focused on the children. Their spirits need to know that they're remembered and loved." That evening, they gathered the items from the crying room and brought them downstairs to add to the altar. They lit more candles and placed the toys and other belongings carefully around the memorial. Emily whispered a prayer for the children, asking for their forgiveness and promising to remember them. As they began the ritual, the air grew heavy with the weight of the past. Dr. Prescott led them in a series of chants, calling upon the spirits of the children to come forward and be at peace. The temperature dropped further, and a soft, spectral glow began to emanate from the items on the altar. The cries of the children filled the room, a chorus of sorrow that made their hearts ache. But gradually the cries softened, turning into whispers of gratitude. The spectral glow brightened, filling the room with a warm, soothing light. Emily, tears streaming down her face, reached out a hand. "You're free now," she said softly. "You can go home." The light grew brighter, enveloping them all in its warmth. For a moment, they felt a sense of profound peace, as if the spirits of the children were finally finding their way to the other side. The glow slowly faded, and the room returned to its normal state. Martha hugged Emily tightly, her own tears flowing freely. "You did it, sweetheart. You helped them find peace." Tom and Michael joined the embrace, their own hearts lightened by the experience. Dr. Prescott watched with a satisfied smile. "You've made great progress. The spirits of this house are beginning to find the peace they've longed for. But there's still more work to be done." As they sat together, the feeling of relief was palpable. They had uncovered another layer of Willowshade Plantation's dark past and taken steps to heal the wounds that lingered. But they knew that the journey was far from over. The next day, the family woke to a house that felt lighter, less burdened by the sorrow of the past. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and there was a sense of hope in the air. Yet they knew that there were still more secrets to uncover, more spirits to set free. As they prepared to face whatever lay ahead, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer just living in a haunted house. They were caretakers of a history that needed to be acknowledged and healed. The crying room had shown them the depth of the plantation suffering, but it had also given them the strength to continue their journey. Willowshade Plantation was slowly becoming a place of remembrance and reconciliation, a testament to the enduring power of love and justice. And the Bennetts were ready to face the challenges that lay ahead, determined to bring light to the darkest corners of their new home. Despite the sense of accomplishment after helping the spirits of the children find peace, The Bennetts knew their journey was far from over. The next few days were relatively calm, but a lingering unease remained in the air. The oppressive atmosphere had lightened, but an undercurrent of tension still flowed through Willowshade Plantation. It wasn't long before the unseen forces made their presence known again. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the lights flickered and a cold breeze swept through the room. Emily shivered, glancing around nervously. "They're still here," she whispered. Michael, trying to be brave, scoffed. "Maybe it's just the old wiring." But as if in response, the chandelier above them began to sway violently, the lights flickering faster. The temperature dropped sharply, and the family huddled together, their breaths visible in the cold air. Suddenly, the table shook, and dishes clattered. The force grew stronger, sending plates and glasses crashing to the floor. Tom jumped up, his protective instincts kicking in. "Everyone, get to the living room!" They hurried out of the dining room, the violent shaking continuing behind them. Once in the living room, the activity seemed to calm, but the oppressive feeling of being watched intensified. "We need to call Dr. Prescott," Martha said, her voice trembling. "Something is still very wrong here." Tom nodded and grabbed the phone. Within an hour, Dr. Prescott arrived, his expression serious as he took in the state of the house. "It seems the spirits are becoming more aggressive," he said. "This often happens when they feel their presence is threatened. They're trying to communicate something important." "But what more could they want?" Michael asked, frustration edging his voice. "We've done everything we can to help them." Dr. Prescott shook his head. "The history of this plantation is deep and complex. There are likely still spirits who haven't been acknowledged, who are desperate to be heard." Emily, who had been silent, suddenly spoke up. "They're angry because they haven't found justice. The ones who hurt them never paid for what they did." The words hung heavily in the air. The family knew Emily was right. The spirits were demanding justice for the wrongs committed against them, seeking retribution against the plantation's dark legacy. The next day, Tom and Martha decided to dig deeper into the plantation's history, determined to uncover the full extent of the horrors that had occurred. They spent hours in the local library, poring over old newspapers, court records, and personal accounts from the time. What they found was chilling. Jonathan Willowshade's cruelty extended far beyond what they had initially uncovered. He had been involved in numerous atrocities, many of which had been covered up or ignored by the authorities of the time. There were accounts of brutal punishments, mysterious disappearances, and even whispers of murder. One name kept appearing in the records: Caleb, Jonathan's overseer, a man known for his ruthless efficiency and sadistic tendencies. It was said that Caleb had been responsible for some of the most heinous acts on the plantation, carrying out Jonathan's orders with a twisted sense of pleasure. That evening, armed with their new knowledge, the Bennetts gathered in the living room with Dr. Prescott. "We need to confront these spirits directly," Dr. Prescott said. "We must acknowledge the full extent of their suffering and demand justice on their behalf." As night fell, they began the ritual. Dr. Prescott led them in chants, calling upon the spirits to come forward. The air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped once more. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, and the whispers began again, louder and more insistent. "Justice. Retribution." The words echoed around them, filling the room with a palpable sense of anger and pain. Emily stepped forward, her small frame trembling but her voice steady. "We hear you," We know what happened to you. We will make sure those who hurt you are remembered for their crimes." As she spoke, the room seemed to vibrate with energy. The shadows coalesced into forms, the spirits of the enslaved men and women appearing before them. Their faces were etched with anguish, their eyes pleading for justice. Tom held up the documents they had found, his voice strong. "We know what Jonathan and Caleb did. Their crimes will not be forgotten. We will tell your stories, and we will ensure that the truth is known." The spirits seemed to waver, their forms flickering in the candlelight. Slowly, they began to retreat, their expressions softening. The oppressive weight in the air lifted slightly, and the temperature began to rise. Dr. Prescott nodded. "They are beginning to find peace. But this is only the beginning. We must continue to honor their memories and demand justice for their suffering." Over the next few days, the Bennetts worked tirelessly to uncover more of the plantation's dark history. They spoke with local historians, visited archives, and even reached out to descendants of those who had lived on the plantation. They compiled their findings into a comprehensive account, detailing the atrocities committed and the lives that had been lost. They shared their research with the community, ensuring that the stories of the enslaved people of Willowshade would not be forgotten. As they continued their efforts, the haunting activity in the house gradually diminished. The whispers became softer, the shadows less menacing. The spirits, finally acknowledged and given a voice, began to find the peace they had long sought. The Bennetts knew that their journey was far from over, but they felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had become the caretakers of Willowshade's legacy, determined to bring justice and healing to a place that had seen so much pain. Willowshade Plantation was slowly transforming from a house of horrors to a place of remembrance and reconciliation. The Bennetts had faced the unseen forces head-on, and through their efforts they were beginning to bring light to the darkest corners of their home. The air at Willowshade Plantation felt lighter as the Bennetts continued their quest for justice. However, the relative calm was short-lived. The spirits' desperation had abated, but their need for revenge was far from satisfied. One night, the house was plunged back into chaos, the spirits' rage flaring up more violently than ever before. It began with a piercing scream that echoed through the halls, jolting the family awake. Emily's terrified cries brought Tom and Martha running to her room. She was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear, pointing at a shadowy figure standing in the corner. "There!" she screamed. "He's right there!" Tom switched on the light, but the figure had vanished, leaving only an icy chill behind. "It's Caleb," Emily whispered, clutching Mr. Hops tightly. "He's here, and he's angry." The family gathered in the living room, shaken and on edge. Dr. Prescott arrived shortly after, his face grim. "It appears the spirits have become more aggressive. Caleb's presence means that the vengeful spirits are demanding retribution, not just acknowledgement." "But what can we do?" Martha asked, her voice trembling. "We've tried to help them find peace." "Sometimes peace cannot be achieved without justice," Dr. Prescott replied. "The spirits want Caleb and Jonathan to pay for their crimes. We need to confront them directly and banish their malignant spirits from this house." The following days were filled with preparations for a final, decisive ritual. Dr. Prescott gathered the necessary materials, including candles, incense, and artifacts from the plantation's past. The Bennetts steeled themselves for the confrontation, knowing it would be the most dangerous task they had undertaken. As night fell, they assembled in the parlor, the air thick with tension. Dr. Prescott began the ritual, his voice steady as he chanted incantations meant to summon the vengeful spirits. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and the temperature dropped sharply. Slowly, the figures of Jonathan, Willowshade, and Caleb materialized before them, their faces twisted with malevolence. The spirits of the enslaved people appeared as well, their forms less distinct but filled with an intense, burning rage. "You will pay for what you have done," Tom said, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. "Your cruelty will not go unpunished." The air crackled with energy as the spirits of Jonathan and Caleb roared in defiance. The room shook, and objects flew through the air, crashing against the walls. The Bennetts stood their ground, their resolve unwavering. Dr. Prescott stepped forward, holding the diary and locket they had found. "These are the tokens of your victims' suffering," he intoned. "Their pain and anguish will be your undoing. We demand justice in their names." The spirits of the enslaved people surged forward, their ethereal forms merging into a torrent of energy that engulfed Jonathan and Caleb. The two men screamed, their spectral bodies writhing in agony as they were consumed by the force of the vengeful spirits. Emily watched in awe and fear as the scene unfolded. "It's working," she whispered. "They're finally getting justice." The energy in the room intensified, reaching a blinding crescendo. The screams of Jonathan and Caleb echoed one last time before their forms disintegrated, leaving nothing but a lingering mist behind. The spirits of the enslaved people began to fade as well, their expressions softening as they finally found the release they had long sought. As the ritual ended, the house fell into a profound silence. The oppressive weight that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and closure. The Bennetts stood together, holding each other tightly, knowing they had achieved something truly monumental. Dr. Prescott smiled, his face lined with exhaustion, but also with satisfaction. "The spirits have found justice. Their tormentors have been banished, and they can now rest in peace." Over the following weeks, the house remained quiet. The oppressive atmosphere that had once pervaded every corner of Willowshade Plantation was gone. The Bennetts continued to honor the memories of the enslaved people who had suffered there, ensuring their stories were never forgotten. Emily no longer heard the whispers in the walls, and her dreams were filled with light instead of darkness. Michael found a new sense of purpose in documenting the plantation's history, determined to share the truth with the world. Tom and Martha, though deeply affected by their experiences, felt a renewed sense of hope and resilience. Willowshade Plantation had transformed from a house of horrors to a place of remembrance and reconciliation. The Bennetts had faced unimaginable challenges, but through their determination and compassion, they had brought justice and peace to a place long haunted by its dark past. As they stood together in the living room, the sun setting outside and casting a warm glow over the room, they knew they had forged a bond not just with each other, but with the spirits they had helped set free. The echoes of agony had finally been silenced, replaced by a sense of enduring peace. Though the Bennetts had succeeded in confronting the vengeful spirits of Jonathan and Caleb, the sense of peace was not complete. There remained an underlying current of unease, suggesting that their work was not yet finished. The plantation still held secrets, and there were spirits that had yet to find peace. One evening, Emily approached her parents, her expression thoughtful. "Mom, Dad, I think there's one more thing we need to do," she said softly. "I keep having dreams about the graveyard. I think we need to go there." Tom and Martha exchanged a look, their faces marked by fatigue and determination. "If you believe that's where we need to go, then we'll do it," Tom said. "Dr. Prescott, do you have any suggestions for a ritual that could help us finish this?" Dr. Prescott nodded. "The graveyard is often the final resting place of many spirits. A ritual of release performed there could help any remaining souls find peace. We'll need to gather some items from the plantation that are tied to the spirits and conduct the ritual at midnight when the veil between the worlds is thinnest." The family spent the next day gathering personal items they had found during their time at Willowshade: Sarah's locket, Joshua's letters, and Mary's comb. As the sun set, they made their way to the old graveyard at the edge of the property. The air was cool and still, and the moon cast a ghostly light over the weathered tombstones. They set up an altar in the center of the graveyard, placing the items carefully and lighting candles around them. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows, and the atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation. Emily, her small frame illuminated by the candlelight, took a deep breath and stepped forward. "We're here to help you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We know what you went through, and we want to set you free." Dr. Prescott began to chant, his voice resonating through the still night air. The family joined hands, forming a circle around the altar. The candle's flames danced wildly, and the temperature dropped sharply. The air seemed to hum with energy, and a faint mist began to rise from the ground. As the chanting continued, the mist thickened, coalescing into spectral forms. The spirits of the enslaved people appeared before them, their faces etched with a mixture of sorrow and hope. They reached out towards the altar, drawn to the items that had once been theirs. Emily held up Sarah's locket, her voice strong. "Sarah, we remember you. You and everyone else who suffered here. We acknowledge your pain and your strength." The spirits moved closer, their forms becoming more defined. The mist swirled around them, and a soft, otherworldly light began to glow from the altar. The air was filled with whispers, not of anguish, but of gratitude and relief. Dr. Prescott raised his arms, his voice rising in a final, powerful incantation. "Spirits of Willowshade Plantation, your suffering has been acknowledged, and your tormentors have been banished. Go now in peace, find your rest, and know that you are remembered." The light from the altar grew brighter, enveloping the spirits in a warm, golden glow. One by one, the spirits began to fade, their expressions serene. The mist dissipated, and the temperature slowly returned to normal. As the last of the spirits vanished, a profound silence settled over the graveyard. The candles flickered and then went out, leaving the family standing in the soft glow of the moonlight. The oppressive weight that had hung over Willowshade Plantation was gone, replaced by a sense of tranquility and closure. The Bennetts stood together, tears of relief and joy streaming down their faces. They had done it. They had helped the spirits find peace and had brought an end to the haunting that had plagued their home. Dr. Prescott smiled, his eyes reflecting the deep satisfaction of a mission accomplished. "You've done a great thing here," he said. "You've not only freed these spirits, but you've also ensured that their stories will be remembered." The family walked back to the house, their steps light and their hearts full. The plantation, once a place of unimaginable suffering, had been transformed into a place of remembrance and healing. They knew that their journey had changed them forever, forging a bond with the past that would endure. As they stood on the porch looking out over the moonlit fields, they felt a profound sense of peace. Willowshade Plantation was no longer a house of horrors. It was a testament to the power of justice, compassion, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The ritual of release had brought closure not only to the spirits, but also to the Bennetts. They had faced unimaginable challenges and had emerged stronger, their family bond deepened by their shared experiences. The plantation was now a place where the past was honored, and the future looked bright. The next morning, as the sun rose over Willowshade Plantation, the Bennetts gathered for breakfast with a renewed sense of hope and purpose. They had transformed their home from a haunted house into a sanctuary of peace and remembrance, and they were ready to face whatever the future held. Their journey had been long and difficult, but they had found the strength to see it through. And in doing so, they had brought light to the darkest corners of Willowshade Plantation, ensuring that the voices of the past would never be forgotten. In the days that followed the final ritual, the Bennetts felt a profound change in the atmosphere of Willowshade Plantation. The oppressive weight of the past had lifted, and the house felt lighter, almost welcoming. The haunting that had once consumed their lives was now a distant memory, replaced by a sense of peace and tranquility. Emily, who had been the most sensitive to the spirits, seemed particularly transformed. Her sleep was no longer plagued by nightmares, and she moved about the house with a newfound confidence. She often spent time in the garden, tending to the flowers and talking to the birds, her laughter echoing through the grounds. Michael, too, found a new sense of purpose. He continued his research into the plantation's history, determined to document the stories of those who had lived and suffered there. He began writing a book, detailing their journey and the lives of the enslaved people whose spirits they had helped set free. Tom and Martha worked together to restore the house, not just physically, but also in spirit. They organized community events, inviting locals to learn about the plantation's history and the importance of remembering the past. The house, once a symbol of pain and suffering, was becoming a place of education and healing. One evening, as the family gathered on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields, they reflected on their journey. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the landscape. The air was filled with the sounds of nature, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had once pervaded the plantation. "I can't believe how much has changed," Martha said, her voice filled with wonder. "This place feels so different now." Tom nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We've come a long way. I'm proud of what we've accomplished." Emily looked up at her parents, her eyes shining. "Do you think the spirits are happy now?" Dr. Prescott, who had become a close family friend, smiled kindly. "I believe they are. You've given them the justice and recognition they deserved. Their souls are at peace, and they will always be remembered." As night fell, the family gathered in the living room for one final act of remembrance. They lit candles and placed them on the altar, surrounded by the items they had collected over the months. The room was filled with a soft, golden light, creating an atmosphere of warmth and serenity. Tom cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "We wanted to take this moment to thank everyone who helped us on this journey, especially Dr. Prescott. We couldn't have done it without you." Dr. Prescott nodded, his eyes glistening. "It was an honor to assist you. Your dedication and bravery made all the difference." Michael stepped forward, holding a small, leather-bound book. "I've been working on this," he said, his voice steady. "It's a collection of the stories we uncovered, the history of Willowshade Plantation, and our journey to bring peace to this place. I want everyone to know what happened here, and to remember the people who suffered and died. The family listened as Michael read a few passages from his book, their hearts swelling with pride and sorrow. The words were a testament to their resilience and the enduring power of justice and compassion. As the candles burned low, Emily placed a final item on the altar, a small handmade wreath of flowers she had picked from the garden. "This is for all the children who were here," she said softly, "so they know they're loved and never forgotten." The room was filled with a profound sense of closure. The Bennetts had faced unimaginable horrors and had emerged stronger, their family bond deepened by their shared experiences. They had transformed their home from a haunted house into a sanctuary of peace and remembrance. As they prepared for bed that night, the house was quiet and still. The oppressive weight of the past had been lifted, and the spirits of Willowshade Plantation had finally found peace. The Bennetts knew that their lives would never be the same, but they were ready to move forward, their hearts lightened by the knowledge that they had made a difference. The next morning, the sun rose over Willowshade Plantation, casting a warm, golden light over the fields. The family stood together on the porch, looking out over the landscape with a sense of hope and renewal. They had faced the darkest corners of their home and had brought light and justice to those who had been forgotten. Willowshade Plantation was no longer a place of horror. It was a testament to the power of love, justice, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The Bennetts had forged a bond with the past that would endure, ensuring that the voices of the enslaved people would never be forgotten. As they stood together, ready to face whatever the future held, they knew that they had created a legacy of remembrance and reconciliation. Willowshade Plantation was haunted no more, its dark past transformed into a beacon of hope and healing.